I had been an MTA worker for years, and the stillness of the night shift had always been a welcome break from the daytime rush. But one night, that tranquility was shattered by an experience that still haunts me. It was a typical night. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the empty platform, and the distant rumble of trains echoed through the tunnels. I was stationed at the control booth, monitoring the cameras and keeping an eye on the station. My coworker, Dave, was on the other side of the platform, making his rounds. As the clock ticked past midnight, I decided to stretch my legs and take a walk around the station. The air was cool and slightly damp, carrying the faint smell of metal and concrete. I walked along the empty platform, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. As I approached the far end of the platform, I heard a faint sound, a whisper. I stopped, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination, and continued my walk. But the whisper came again, this time louder and more distinct. "Help me." I turned around, shining my flashlight down the tunnel. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty tracks. My heart rate quickened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I called out, "Is anyone there?" but there was no response. I walked back to the control booth, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Dave was sitting inside, his eyes glued to the monitors. "Hey, did you hear anything different just now?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked up, puzzled. "Different how?" "I thought I heard someone whispering for help." Dave shrugged. "Probably just the wind in the tunnels. This place can play tricks on you at night." I nodded, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I sat down at my desk, keeping a close eye on the monitors. The station remained empty, the platforms deserted. About an hour later, as I was reviewing some paperwork, I noticed something on one of the cameras. A figure was standing at the far end of the platform, half hidden in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I leaned closer to the screen, trying to get a better look. "Dave, come here," I called, my voice trembling. He joined me at the monitor, his expression serious. "Who is that?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know. It doesn't look like a passenger." The figure was motionless, just standing there, watching the camera. I picked up the radio and called out, "Hey, you down there? The station is closed. You need to leave." The figure didn't move or respond. Dave and I exchanged a nervous glance. "I'll go check it out," he said, grabbing his flashlight. I watched on the monitor as Dave made his way down the platform, his flashlight beam dancing through the darkness. He reached the spot where the figure had been standing, but there was no one there. Dave turned and looked back at the camera, shrugging. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "Maybe it was just a shadow," I said, trying to reassure myself. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As the night wore on, the sense of unease grew stronger. I kept hearing faint whispers, seeing flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure on the platform. Around 3 a.m., the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the tunnels, echoing through the station. I walked over to the edge of the platform, shining my flashlight down the tracks. "Help me, please." The voice was closer now, almost right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. Dave returned, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah," I replied, my hands trembling. "We need to find out what's going on." We decided to search the tunnels together, hoping to find the source of the whispers. The air grew colder as we ventured deeper into the darkness, our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. As we rounded a bend, we saw the figure again, standing in the middle of the tracks. This time, it was clearer, a man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his face twisted in agony. "Help me," he whispered, reaching out a hand. We froze, fear paralyzing us. The man's eyes were hollow, his skin pale and translucent. He took a step toward us, and we backed away, our flashlight shaking. "Who are you?" Dave demanded, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He kept moving closer, his hand outstretched. The air grew colder, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. We turned and ran, our footsteps echoing through the tunnels. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more frantic. We burst out onto the platform, gasping for breath, and ran back to the control booth. We locked the door behind us, our hearts pounding. The whispers continued, now coming from all around us. The figure appeared on the monitors again, this time closer, moving slowly toward the booth. "We need to get out of here," Dave said, his voice shaking. I nodded, grabbing my bag. We made a run for the exit, the whispers echoing in our ears. As we reached the street, the whispers stopped, replaced by the distant sounds of the city. We reported the incident to our supervisor, who promised to investigate. The next night, we were both reassigned to different stations. I never worked at High Street Station again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there, waiting in the darkness. The station, once a place of routine and familiarity, had become a source of fear and uncertainty. If you're enjoying it so far, subscribe so you don't miss any new creepy story. There was something intoxicating about the freedom of train hopping. The wind in your hair, the thrill of jumping onto a moving freight train, and the sense of adventure that came with each journey. When I was younger, train hopping was my escape from the monotony of everyday life. After years of leaving that hobby behind, I decided to revisit it, hoping to recapture that feeling of exhilaration. It was a warm summer evening, the sky painted with the colors of sunset as I walked along the old train tracks near my hometown. The air was filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I knew these tracks well, they ran through miles of farmland and forests, providing the perfect route for an adventure. I found a spot where the tracks curved, slowing the trains just enough for me to hop on. I waited, listening for the familiar rumble of an approaching train. After about an hour, I heard it, the distant clatter of wheels on metal. My heart raced with anticipation as the train rounded the bend, its headlights piercing the twilight. As the train slowed, I jogged alongside it, grabbing hold of a ladder and pulling myself up. The train picked up speed again, and I climbed onto an open boxcar, settling in for the ride. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness enveloped the landscape. The night air was cool and refreshing, and I leaned back against the side of the boxcar, enjoying the ride. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels was soothing, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. As the train sped through the countryside, I watched the stars twinkle above, feeling a connection to the vastness of the world. But as the night wore on, that sense of peace began to wane. I started hearing strange noises, soft, almost imperceptible sounds that seemed out of place. At first, I dismissed them as the creaks and groans of the old train, but the noises grew more distinct. It sounded like someone was whispering, their voice carried away by the wind. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the night. There was no response, just the steady clatter of the train. I stood up and shone my flashlight around the boxcar, illuminating the empty space. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and settled back down, but the whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was menacing, filled with a cold, unsettling malice. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew I wasn't alone. I turned my flashlight towards the far end of the boxcar, and that's when I saw it, a figure, crouched in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out any details, but the figure remained obscured by darkness. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The the figure didn't move or respond. It just crouched there, watching me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another train hopper, a drifter, or something else entirely? The train rumbled on, the landscape speeding past in a blur. I kept my flashlight trained on the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to move, to jump off the train and run, but fear kept me rooted in place. Finally, the figure stood up, slowly and deliberately. It stepped into the beam of my flashlight, revealing a gaunt, pale face with hollow eyes. The sight sent a wave of terror through me, and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the side of the boxcar. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The figure didn't answer. It just stared at me, its eyes dark and empty. I felt a surge of panic and scrambled to my feet, inching toward the edge of the boxcar. The figure took a step closer, and I knew I had to get out of there. Without thinking, I jumped off the train, rolling down an embankment and landing hard on the ground. Pain shot through my side, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and looked back at the train, which was now disappearing into the distance. The figure stood at the edge of the boxcar, watching me. Its silhouette was stark against the moonlit sky, and I felt its gaze burning into me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached a small town about a mile away. I collapsed on a bench at the train station, gasping for breath, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, its hollow eyes staring into my soul. I decided to wait until morning before heading home. The train station was deserted, and I felt a sense of safety in the familiarity of the place. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I finally began to relax. When I returned home, I told my girlfriend what I had seen. She laughed it off, saying I must have been imagining things or that it was just a drifter trying to scare me. But I knew what I had seen, and the memory haunted me. I never hopped a train again. The thrill of the adventure had been replaced by a deep-seated fear that I couldn't shake. Every time I heard the distant rumble of a train, I felt a chill run down my spine, and the whispers would return, echoing in my mind. Growing up in a small town, there were always ghost stories circulating, and the legend of the phantom train was one of the most popular. It was said that late at night, on the abandoned tracks that ran through the outskirts of town, you could hear the whistle of a ghostly train that vanished years ago. As a teenager, I never believed in such things, but one night, curiosity got the better of me. It was a chilly autumn evening, and a group of friends and I were hanging out around a campfire in the woods. We were roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and trying to spook each other with tales of ghosts and monsters. The night was clear, the full moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As the night wore on, someone brought up the story of the phantom train. We all laughed and dismissed it as nonsense, but the idea intrigued me. After all, the old tracks were only a short walk from our campsite. I suggested we go check it out, half joking, but to my surprise, everyone agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and set off through the woods, the beams cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder as we approached the tracks, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away, replaced by an unsettling silence. The tracks appeared, rusty and overgrown with weeds, stretching into the darkness. We walked along the tracks, joking and trying to scare each other. The fun atmosphere helped to mask my growing unease. The further we went, the darker and more oppressive the night seemed to become. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After about 20 minutes of walking, we reached an old, decrepit bridge that spanned a narrow ravine. The wood creaked under our weight as we crossed, adding to the eerie ambience. On the other side, the tracks continued into a thick fog that had started to roll in. As we ventured further into the fog, the temperature seemed to drop even more. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. One of my friends, Jacob, suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all listened, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of our own breathing. But then, faintly, we heard it, a distant whistle, carried on the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Probably just the wind, Luna said, trying to sound brave. But I could see the fear in her eyes. We continued walking, our footsteps hesitant now. The whistle came again, louder this time. And then we saw it, a faint light in the distance, like the headlamp of an old train. It moved slowly through the fog, casting long shadows on the ground. We froze, watching in disbelief as the light grew closer. The outline of a train began to take shape, its wheels clattering softly on the tracks. The train looked old, its paint faded and peeling, and its windows dark and empty. Is this some kind of joke? Tim asked, his voice shaking. I don't think so, I replied, my eyes fixed on the approaching train. We should go. But none of us moved. We were rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the sight. The train drew nearer, its whistle now deafening. I could feel the vibrations in the ground as it passed by, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the windows, pale, ghostly faces, staring out at us. The train passed us, continuing down the tracks into the fog. We stood there, too stunned to speak, until it disappeared from sight. The silence that followed was suffocating. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the fear building inside me. We need to get out of here, I said finally, breaking the silence. Now. We turned to leave, but as we did, we heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction the train had gone. I shone my flashlight into the fog, and my heart nearly stopped. A figure emerged from the mist, walking along the tracks. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his face pale and expressionless. He moved with a strange, unnatural gait, his eyes fixed on us. We backed away, our flashlight shaking. Who are you? Jacob called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. He just kept walking toward us, his eyes never leaving ours. I felt a wave of panic and turned to run, the others following close behind. We sprinted back across the bridge, the wood creaking ominously under our weight. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. We huddled around the fire, trying to make sense of what we had seen. The fog had lifted, and the night was still and quiet once more. What the hell was that? Luna asked, her voice breaking. I don't know, I replied, my mind racing. But I'm not going back there. We decided to pack up and leave, the fear still fresh in our minds. As we walked back to our cars, I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see the figure following us. But there was nothing, just the dark silhouettes of the trees. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had nightmares about the train and the conductor, waking up in a cold sweat with the sound of the whistle echoing in my ears. I tried to find out more about the phantom train, but the stories were all the same, vague legends and ghostly sightings. I never went back to those tracks. The memory of that night was enough to keep me away. My friends and I drifted apart, the shared terror of that experience too much to bear. We never spoke about it again. Graffiti was my passion. There was something exhilarating about sneaking into places where I wasn't supposed to be, armed with nothing but my spray cans and creativity. Train yards, with their rusty old cars and endless walls, were my favorite canvases. That night started like any other. I slipped into the old train yard, the one near the abandoned factory on the edge of town. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but that's how I liked it. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the scene. I walked along the tracks, my backpack clinking with the sound of spray cans. The train yard was a maze of old cars and overgrown weeds. The place had been out of use for years, and it felt like a world frozen in time. I found my spot, a rusted boxcar that had once been bright red but was now a faded, chipped remnant of its former self. I pulled out my cans, shaking them to hear the familiar rattle. As I started spraying, the sound echoed through the empty yard, the hiss of paint meeting metal almost soothing. I was in my zone, lost in my art, when I heard the first strange noise. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves or the scurrying of a small animal. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear. The night was still, the only sound the distant hum of the highway and the occasional chirp of crickets. I shook it off and continued spraying, but the noise came again, louder this time. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart rate quickened. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. I crouched behind the boxcar, listening intently. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. I peered around the corner, expecting to see a security guard or maybe another graffiti artist, but there was no one. I waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps stopped. Cautiously, I turned my flashlight back on and resumed my work, trying to shake off the unease. I had just finished a large piece when I heard a whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the night sounds, but it was there. "Leave." I spun around, shining my flashlight in all directions. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty tracks and abandoned cars. There was no one there. My pulse raced, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The wind could play tricks on you in a place like this. I packed up my gear, deciding it was time to leave. As I walked back toward the entrance, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved swiftly between two train cars. I stopped, shining my flashlight in the direction of the movement. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I continued walking, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. When I reached the gate, I found it closed. I distinctly remembered leaving it open. Panic set in as I fumbled with the latch, finally managing to pry it open and slip through. I was almost in my car when I heard the footsteps again, this time running. I broke into a sprint, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were right behind me, gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. Breathless, I looked through the windshield and saw a figure standing at the edge of the train yard. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. The figure stood there, motionless, as if daring me to come back. I started the car and floored it, speeding out of there as fast as I could. My mind raced with questions. Who was that? What did they want? I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still standing there, but the road behind me was empty. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the house, made my heart race. The next day, I told a friend about what had happened. He suggested we go back together, during the day, to check it out. Reluctantly, I agreed. We arrived at the train yard in the early afternoon. The place looked different in the daylight, less intimidating, but the memory of the night before still sent chills down my spine. We walked through the yard, inspecting the area where I had been. My graffiti was still there, untouched. As we explored, we found something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt, near the boxcar I had been painting, were footprints. They led away from the spot where I had seen the figure, disappearing into the weeds. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We left the train yard, and I vowed never to return. But the nightmare didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, heard whispers when I was alone. One night, I woke up to find a message scrawled on my bedroom window, written in what looked like mud. Leave. I moved out of my apartment, hoping to escape whatever was haunting me. The strange occurrences stopped, but the fear lingered. I never went back to that train yard, and I gave up graffiti altogether. The thrill of tagging wasn't worth the terror that followed. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I learned that some places are best left alone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button for more terrifying tales. Don't miss our latest video, Scary True Night Shift Stories, Volume 2, where we share more eerie and unsettling experiences from people working the night shift. These stories will make you think twice about what happens after dark. See you in the next video.